Okay. Hello, everyone. Lecture 4. Today we'll be talking about energy, a challenging but very useful, interesting subject. Just before we dig deep into it, I'll just mention that the final assignment is approaching. And so I would ask you by next lecture to send your idea for a project. It could be just an initial idea, and we could go back and forth in terms of like bring it to the final stages. What you need to do as part of the final project is choose a question, kind of like the questions that we were presenting here, and something that's of interest to you or that you study. It could be very nice if it relates to your research. That could bring another level of a more deeper level in terms of the knowledge involved. And what you'll need to do is give a 5 minutes presentation in front of the class. If you want to see examples for that, we have it on the website, some links to 2 examples on YouTube from last year. And usually it starts with some question that you can involve the people with trying to answer, or you'll give, or just go directly to you giving the answer that's usually based on some calculation that you'll be doing. Okay, so it's in the spirit of the course, and usually we'd like to get some insight from that calculation, of course, as well. And then that would also serve as the basis for the vignette that you'll be writing. That's also in the spirit of the vignettes that you've been reading, of about 2 to 3 pages. You raise a question, you say what are the numbers from the literature, how can you use that to infer some further knowledge and further insights about biological cells. Okay, makes sense? Any questions, ideas for suggestions? I'm actually quite open. If you have a different way to involve, instead of just a regular calculation, you want to, I don't know, do something else in class that would be on the same concepts and ideas, you're welcome to suggest other interesting ideas. Okay, so the floor is open for that. Yeah.
This question has to be in the cell level?
Does it have to be what?
In the cell level?
On the cell level? Well, actually, as you'll see today, we'll actually be moving from the cell to the global level. So it doesn't have to be exactly the cell. It could be at the organism level, the ecosystem level. We had all sorts of fun stuff last year. Yeah, so you can come up with any crazy, creative idea. Just throw it our way. And if it's too crazy, we'll tell you. Any other questions? Okay, so as we move into energies, I'll say this is a very challenging subject. Any guesses why it's so challenging? Let's say in comparison to last lecture, which was about concentrations, or the previous lectures was about sizes. Yeah, so it's, I guess both things are correct. One is it's less intuitive, and the other is it could be very hard to measure. So both things are correct. Sizes, we could really very easily define what it is, and we have some intuition about it. Even if it's not at the microscopic level, it's still, we know that I can do like that, and then I do like that, and you understand what I mean about the size of, I don't know, like a yeast cell versus an E. coli cell. But then when we talk, even I want to tell you, about the photon energy versus the hydrophobic effect energy, or the hydrogen bond energy, well, it's not so really clear what's happening there. And also measuring them could really depend on how do you want to define things. So that's going to be one of the challenges facing us. But on the other hand, I hope you'll see that it could really connect us to making sense what can happen by cells, what cannot happen, how things could connect from us to all sorts of global issues. So it's worthwhile trying to master that, even if it's going to be somewhat more challenging. And so let's start with a place that we started with last time, and that is, what is the characteristic power consumption of a human? And we had a few options for that. That was, I guess, 10 to the 0 watts, 10 to the 1 watts, 10 to the 2 watts, and 10 to the 3 watts. But then I guess it's useful to then just remind us all what is a watt, right? So what is it? Something with joule, right? Joule per second. Okay, so it's good to remind ourselves that watt, by definition, is joule, which is a unit of energy by second. And that is actually, that really tells you that actually watts is not energy, right? So even though we're in a lecture about energies, right now we're talking about power. That's why I was sure to say power consumption, meaning energy per unit time. Okay? So we'd like to know the answer to that, and this would lead us to the next question, and that is, how much land is needed to supply this power consumption? That is through food. Okay, so we need some amount of power, some amount of watts. And in order to do that, we're doing it by using land in order to grow our food. And we want to know how much land is that. Who wants to know the answer to that? Just checking about your curiosity. Okay, so you are interested. That's good. So what we'll be doing now is I want you to team up in pairs. It could be somebody you know or somebody you don't know, might even be better. So we have some mix here. And I want you to try and derive the answer to the first question. And all those who are successful, you can then move to trying to derive the second question, which is somewhat more challenging. It could be done in different ways. I would say every way is legitimate as far as I'm concerned. And you have 5 to 10 minutes to try and do that in pairs. Is the challenge clear? Okay. בהצלחה. Quite a lot of interest in knowing this, the answer to this. So I'm sorry to stop you in the middle. You can keep on working on similar questions, but I'd like to move on by giving you one way to approach it. So first of all, let's start with the first question. I think on that, basically, you've got it from what I could tell. You've got it very well. So how did you start to approach it to get an answer for how many watts are we consuming? Food. So it's good to start. So this is something that's well in our memory. And that is, what number would you start with? Right, so we're supposed to consume, right? At least supposed to consume something like 2,000 to 2,500 calories per day. Right, so I see that most people started with that good number. Okay, so calories or kilocalories, right? So it's very confusing. So calories, or what we usually call calories with a big C, is actually, just like you point out, it's actually a kilocalorie with a small c, or also known as, these are big calories, and there are small calories. So yeah, it's kind of funny, but it could make a 3 orders of magnitude difference, so we need to know that. Okay, so this is actually 2,000 kcal per day. Okay, now we want to move from that to the watts, and it's kind of similar to how we usually need to do things. We just need to do the right number conversion. So let's do it here. We have 2,000, the big calories that we started with, per day. And we want to start converting it. So a calorie, how do we convert from calories to joules? Okay, so we need to multiply by about 4. By definition, I think it's 4.2 or something like that. And because it's like big calories, we need to multiply it by about 4,000 joules per 1 kcal. Okay, so this is multiplying by 1, as we love to do. So this would fall, these calories and kcalories, which are the same thing. I would have joules per day, right? Okay, so that brings me to what? This is roughly how many calories, how many joules per day? About 10 to the 7. right? By the way, what is the difference between writing it this way with 1 tilde and having a double tilde? Right, so this means that this is order of magnitude, whereas with this, I mean really that something is pretty close, say 10% difference, maybe even twofold, but I really mean the number, whereas with this I mean order of magnitude. Okay? This is actually not a great example because here we're really pretty close, so it's even better than order of magnitude. I almost mean double tilde in this case. Okay, but it's good to know that in some cases you'll just want to have an order of magnitude rather than approximately. Okay, so just as a definition, this is order of magnitude. And this is approximately. And I actually have been having fights with editors in journals about the fact that I don't want them to mark things this way, but rather this way. But I think it's actually useful for us, communicating and knowing whether we really mean something very, very crude or something that maybe is not completely accurate, but you really mean the number that you put there into better than order of magnitude. Okay, so going back to this, we have about 10 to the 7 joules per day, and we want it in watts. So what do we need to multiply by? We need to do the conversion, right, from a day to seconds. So what is the conversion ratio? So this is part of the tricks that you have in the tricks of the trade of doing this kind of, so it's good you need to multiply by 60, again 60, and then 24, but that brings us to about 10 to the 5. So we have 1 day divided by 10 to the 5 seconds. That's again multiplying by 1. So that leaves me with 2 to the 2 watts, joules per second. Okay, so 100 watts. How can I try and, so again, in the energies, it's always challenging in terms of our intuition. So how would you explain to me what 100 watts is? Light bulbs, yeah. So we're usually surrounded by light bulbs. So what about light bulb? So it used to be like a light bulb. Usually light bulbs would be like 60 watts, 100 watts. And with the advance of like more, with better and more efficient light bulbs, we're getting the same number of lumens. What is a lumen? So lumen is a measure of how much our eye is able to respond to photons. So we're able to get roughly the same number of photons. It also depends on the spectrum. But roughly the same amount of lumens or candles is another funny unit for energy coming in the form of light. Such that you're getting the same amount for much less, something like, say, 25 watts or 20 watts, the new light bulbs, and you're getting the effectively like 60 to 100 watts. So in today's units, you can think it's maybe a few light bulbs. Okay, so that's what a human is consuming continuously. And of course, there's a difference whether you're just, when you're sleeping, it would be somewhat less than that. When you're running the marathon, it would be several times that. I think they say that, like in the Tour de France, you need to eat somewhere around between 5,000 and 10,000 calories per day, which makes sense given the amount of endurance that you need to show in such an event.
We were debating about the efficiency of this process.
Okay, so the efficiency of this process. How would you define the efficiency here?
How much energy I actually
consume out of the gross energy which I get from the food.
Okay, so in terms of efficiency, it's really always a question of how do you want to define things. So in this case, you can ask, on the one hand, you know that you're producing heat at the rate of 100 watts on the average. And if I knew that I was, say, going some elevation, going up a mountain, I can calculate the amount of energy I sort of like stored as potential energy, and from that you can do one calculation on efficiency. But I guess you're referring to a different kind of efficiency. You're saying from the heat or the energy that would come from the food, how much energy in the biochemistry would be stored, say, in the form of ATP or something like that, right? That's what you had in mind. Okay, it depends what process exactly. Like a good number is about a third. In terms of the biochemical reactions going, say, from, say, food, you can think about as glucose, and you can think about the number of ATPs being produced. Say, you're doing respiration, you're making, say, 30 ATPs per glucose. You can do the thermodynamics of how much heat of combustion there is in the glucose you started with, and how much is being stored in the ATP that will be produced. And the third would be a reasonable value for that. How much you use in the brain? So I think if you do a breakdown, I think you could have about a fifth of the energy being consumed by the brain. Anyone knows anything better number?
120 grams per day.
What?
120 grams per glucose per day.
Okay, so that's in units of glucose, yes. Glucose per day. Okay, so we might even connect it to something in a second. So one other way to remember, which is nice, so you can say that so if we use about 100 watts, what is the density of energy that we need, or power that we're creating? So that's about 1 watt per kilogram. It's a nice round number to carry. So that's if you want to think about different people of different sizes. And actually, you can even do it across organisms. There's some scaling that people are still fighting in the literature. If you ever heard about the 1/4 scaling that relates to the power per unit mass that is required. But if you remember that number, that would take you a long way in thinking about many, many different organisms.
It's again related to the question about the brain, because the brain is roughly the same size for small people.
Okay, so the brain does not become something that, the brain takes more than its share in terms of the mass, but it doesn't take, like 80% of the overall, like it's not a dominant part of the mass that is, of the energy or power that is being consumed. So it could have, some effect, but it wouldn't change, if I'm giving you like this round order of magnitude, the mass of the brain would not change that in a substantial manner. How does that compare to some other units of energy that we know? Like what other units of energy do you come about? So there's like the horsepower, right? That's like when you want to talk about the energy or the power that is being produced by cars. So anyone knows something about horsepower? Right, so it's about 700 watts. So we're about 1/10 of horsepower, even though horses do not really give exactly horsepowers. But that's a different subject. But so like every 7 students here are about 1 horsepower.
There is the dashboard.
Okay, so now we have the challenge of moving from here to the second question, right?
For how long?
For how long? You mean in terms of land?
How much land is needed to supply this power for how long a time?
Okay, so this is a great question. Let me try to repeat it for a second. You're saying, so like the question is ill-defined.
It's indefined.
Ill-defined. Okay, let's talk about it for a minute. Why do you say it's ill-defined? Because you're saying it depends for over how long, right?
But you have time units there, you have seconds, so it's for 1 second.
Okay, so you're saying it's not ill-defined. Okay, so actually this is a great point to just mention with these things of energies and power. One has to be extremely careful, and I have been extremely careful, but it could be really confusing. So let's see what could be the problem here. This is the amount of power needed, meaning the amount of energy per unit time. And we're talking about the field here, like amount of land. We're thinking about a wheat field or whatever that would be supplying some food. So you can say, okay, if a person needs some amount of food, okay, over how long do you want to use the land in order to produce the food, right? So you have to define, is it over a year, a few years, a month? That's all that was your question all about. Okay, but what I'm saying is actually, this is actually not ill-defined. This is very well defined because this is what is required in terms of power. And if you look at the field, you can say it also supplies food at some average rate. We'll do that in just a minute. And then I can say, okay, if this gives me per unit area some amount of power, that's actually well defined for answering this question. But I think it is good to run it in your head one time and see, okay, why there could have been a problem. Actually, there's no problem. And thanks for that question. Okay, so the way I want to approach it is first of all to have a strategy, because it's not like some of the questions really you can just really jump in and solve them, kind of like what we did just here. Other questions, it's good to have some tactic on how to approach them. So what would be what would be the end that would look that we're after? That would be, of course, how much area is needed. That would be the punchline. Now, what do I need to put in order to get the area needed?
Energy per area.
Okay, so I need the energy per area and
Time taken to grow whatever you
okay, this is the energy that would come per area, and I need the energy needed, right?
But it's energy per area per time, because growing is something else. So it's energy per area time.
Excuse me, okay, it's power per area. Yeah, you're right, sorry. Power per area and power needed. Thanks for that correction. As you can see, this is very tricky business. You can easily, but then if you're careful with the units, you'll never go wrong. The units would tell you if you made some mistake. Okay, so the power needed, that's quite easy, right? We just dealt with that. But then we need the power per area. Okay, how would we get the power per area? We need some strategy for that. So for that, we need something about the power from sun per area. And what else? The conversion efficiency. So that goes again to the question of efficiency. What I'm talking about conversion efficiency, this is conversion by, we need it in the end, so this is food. This is photosynthesis.
Why, excuse me?
Yes.
Why do I have to go to the power of the sun and not like calculate the average growth, how much it will give me, and consider this?
Okay, so basically, so this is like, if you already know the power per area, meaning how much growth you'll get per unit area, you can do it directly from there.
Okay.
Okay, I'm saying in order to know that, if I don't have it off the top of my head, I'm saying let's try to go, I usually try to take it to as much fundamental things as I can, which is not always easy, but I'm saying, okay, power from the sun per unit area, that's something quite fundamental.
Okay.
And the conversion...
It translates directly to the power you can get from whatever you grow?
Well, okay, so if you define your conversion efficiency of photosynthesis, meaning from the amount of energy that you get from the sun, multiplied by the efficiency, would give you how much power or food energy per unit area.
But you don't eat all
You need to multiply it by extraction.
Right, so okay, so this is conversion efficiency of photosynthesis, let's say, to grains.
Also from the grains, you need to multiply it in extraction efficiency.
Okay, so give me a chance and we'll get there. This is now we're talking about, this is going from the level of tactics to, from strategy to micro tactics. That's in a bit later. Okay, so the flow makes sense. Okay, so we already have much of our, some of the work done, right? We've got this done. Okay, now let's go to this. What do you think about the power coming from the sun? How much is that?
1,000 watts per meter square.
Okay, I have 1,000. Anything else comes to mind? So it's a bit hard, right? Let's think about it again with the light bulbs, okay? That might help you if you're not sure. Let's think, so we usually think about the amount of power flowing through a meter square. Yeah, so I have a meter square here. I'm going out into the sun, let's say in the midday where the sun is just above me. And I want to know how much energy flows through that. Let's think about it in light bulbs. How many light bulbs do you think effectively come from the sun per unit area? If I wanted to put light bulbs, that would give me the same intensity of light. Is the question clear? I don't remember anything about the sun power. Assume you don't know. I do know, but that's fine. And I wanted to estimate it. How many light bulbs would you say would give me the same flux per meter square? The floor is open for suggestions. I have 5. I have 100.
I think lux is about, no?
Okay, lux is fine, but I want to talk now in light bulbs. How many light bulbs do I have to put that would go through, that would give me the same amount of light as what comes from the sun in a shiny day, the sun just about me, per meter square? 20. Okay. Let's start with this. So I have 3 estimations. What do we do when we have a few estimations? We do the average, okay? We sometimes denote it by mu. Okay, what type of average? Geometrical average, very good. Okay, so to do a geometrical average, how do I do that? I need to multiply. We sometimes mark it by pi. 5 times 100 times 20. And then I have to take the root, quadratic root. Okay, we can do it on the exponent. Forget it, doesn't matter. Okay, so what do we have here? 5 times 20 is 100. 100 times 100, that's 10,000. And this would bring me to about 20. 20 and a bit. Okay, so that's light bulbs. Okay, how much watts is a light bulb? Okay, so it depends what light bulb, right? We have the old ones, which are 100 watts, the new ones, which are like 20 watts. So let's take the geometrical root again. Okay, 120, that's 2,000, square root of 2,000, that's about 40, right? Okay, so this times 40 watts per light bulb, this brings us to what? About 800, right? You follow my calculation or your estimation? Okay, and the right number, well, we had it already from the beginning, so it's about 1,000. This is the number to carry in your head. Actually, outside of the atmosphere, it's about 1,300 watts integrated over all the whole sun spectrum. But then through the atmosphere, you get about 1,000 coming in. And interestingly, from just a few light bulbs and something like that, you get something that is not very far from that. Okay, so we're done with this one. We have about 1,000 watts. Excuse me. Yeah, of course. This was all per meter square because this was the light bulbs were counted per meter square. Yeah. So okay, we'll get Okay. So how do we now move forward from here?
Is it an average or this is a maximum?
Right. Yeah. So this is exactly so these are these are the right questions to move ahead. This was per meter square midday, right? If we want to talk about efficiency, we don't talk about in a second, right? We're talking about over some period of time. What should we take into account in terms of the sun? First of all, we should take night into account, right? So how much would night give you? A factor of 2, right? Okay. So because of night, this would change by a factor of 2. What else is important?
Just on the geometrical simple.
So we had 1,000 watts per meter square, and that was midday. This was converted. We take day-night. This would take us to 500. Watts per meter square. Now people said, okay, now we need to take into account the seasons. Why do I care about the seasons?
Because it makes rains only one or two seasons at most.
Okay.
Change the time of us to 12 hours.
Because the sun is not above me, right? So it's not only the season, right? It's something else as well. In the day, it's always above me.
The latitude where you
It depends where you're compared to the...
Okay, so there's a whole thing about latitude. But what happens, in the morning? I'm getting the same amount of sun as I'm getting in midday. No, so there's the whole thing about, what would be the angle of incidence, right, of the sun. And that goes together with the whole issue of the latitude and what season you're in, right? So what effect would that give me? Like if I wanted to know, on the average, how much effect would that give?
You have the summer, which is you have a longer day, and
right? So I have the summer, which would be a longer day, and the winter, which would be a shorter day. But every day in the morning, I would have less in the beginning, and then more, and then less again. But how much? What would be the overall factor of all that, roughly? So roughly, you're saying half, right? So another factor of 2. You know, so there's a fun thing here, right? So I would say half. I would agree with you. I would go with that, 250 watts per meter square. So that's not only seasons, but that's incidence angle, time of day. Okay, so here's a challenge for you next time you're in a boring lecture. From thinking about geometry, it turns out this is exactly a factor of 2. Not approximately, even though there's the whole thing together, the latitude, the time of the day, the summer, the winter, exactly a factor of 2. Okay, and actually you can have, if you have cousins which are like in junior high school is maybe pushing it, but let's say in high school you can give them that puzzle and they're supposed to be able to solve it. Okay, geometry. Okay, but I wouldn't do it now. This is just for whenever you have some free time. Okay, so is this the number to take away? Anything else that you might want to add in? I think clouds could also be nice to put in. So if you put clouds, I know dust, aerosols, whatever, I would say 200 watts per meter square. That's a good number that's being mentioned very often for how much energy on the average arrives per meter square. Average over the year, over day-night, over the seasons, the times of the day. Yes?
All these assumptions, the changes between them, how much would they affect the final result? Let's say I took a different assumption.
Yes, so you're right. Let's say, so it's a good question about how sensitive are we to everything we're doing here. So we already know, right? If between 1,000 watts to 200 is a factor of 5. So it's definitely not negligible. A factor of 5 is something, sometimes it's negligible. In this case, I wouldn't say it's negligible. But it doesn't matter if instead of factor of 2, I would have taken something a bit different, no big deal. If I would have forgotten to, take into account clouds, etc., that's also not a big deal. But I wouldn't want to lose a factor of 4 just before because I didn't think about that. Okay? So we had 1,000, but actually I would say effectively we should think about 200 watts per meter squared. Okay, now we have a more challenging factor, and that is to think about the conversion efficiency of photosynthesis. What would you think is the conversion efficiency of photosynthesis? I hear very low. I hear 5%, 1%. Well, indeed, it's very low. It's actually, so if we're thinking about the overall conversion efficiency, so okay, first of all, let's talk about theoretical efficiency, okay? Theoretical, it's about 10%. That's like in ideal conditions, it actually is never arrived, not in the lab or in the field. You can not do more than 10%, and we'll talk in a second, what causes that. But on top of that, there's like, the actual efficiency that you find, say, in agriculture, in fields. And there, if you're talking about from the sun, from these 200 watts per meter square that hit them on the average, to what you get in grains, that's about, let's call it actual, in field. That is about 0.5%. I was quite surprised when I saw it for the first time. So let's talk about it for a second. What happens there? And obviously, evolution was working hard on making this number high. So there's actually like a whole 2-hour lecture that I sometimes give about the whole steps in the efficiency of this. So this is not exactly the essence of our course. So we'll just touch some of it. Anyone who wants to know more, there's actually good stuff, good references that I can give you on that, or I think I have the lecture online somewhere. So let's start with the theoretical. We're starting from the energy coming from the sun. So you could look at the solar spectrum, let's say as a function of the wavelength. You have some distribution of the energy or the power. Do you know how does this look like? Or so this is what's known as like black body radiation. Okay, so the sun is in a temperature about somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 Kelvin. It emits black body radiation that arrives at us. It has some spectrum. So what's the first thing here in terms of our efficiency? Exactly. You're not able to use the whole spectrum. You're only able to use something that has more energy than some quanta. Anything that has less energy than that is not useful for you. Okay, so if we're doing it as a function of frequency, we have some value here that anything below it is not efficient and only this could be used. This is the infrared. And here it's the visible, mostly, and some UV that can be used. And by that, you're losing about a factor of 2 already. Okay, about half of the radiation could not be used because it's not in the wavelength that could be utilized. Okay, so that's where we're starting. So that's, first of all, in terms of the solar spectrum. It gives us about a factor of 2, roughly. Then the next effect is that in the end, you have some complicated, what's known as a photosystem, where you're absorbing a photon, it excites something in the chlorophyll, and then it's being used. But it doesn't matter how much energy, like as a function of the frequency, you'll be getting more and more energy. If you're exciting by more than the minimal amount, actually that's all being wasted, that could not be used. And only the amount that the minimal that is required, that is the amount that could be used for doing what's known as photochemistry. So this is called like the band gap effect, like the extra energy that is not useful, and that gives you another roughly a factor of 2. If this was a bit quick and confusing, we could talk about it some other time in some more length. Okay, now all of this is so like, it doesn't mean that all of the photons arriving could be used by the field. Because of what? What would cause, a photon coming to a field to not be used?
It's not hitting the...
One option is that it's not, there's no plant waiting for it there, right? There's still some area there, and also along the season, you're starting from a very small seedling to a whole plant, so it could be lost in that way. That's one mechanism. What would be another mechanism?
Reflection.
So it might be reflected. That's true, but a small fraction. Scattering.
Absorbance by water.
So there's something called photoinhibition. That refers to the fact that plants, even though they'll be sitting in the middle of the day and getting a lot of photons coming from the sun that are in the right place in the spectrum, and you can use some of their energy, actually there's too much of it coming. They're not able to utilize all of it. And that what happens is that some of it is being used, and the other, through process of photoinhibition, they're being diverted into heat so as not to hurt the plant. Otherwise, you're producing too much reactive oxygen species, and that creates havoc inside the cell. So these two things together, the land cover plus the photoinhibition, this could be two very significant factors of, I don't know, roughly like a 5-fold or something like that you might lose. So because either it's hitting the land, there's nothing to absorb it, or it's being absorbed, but there's too much of it, and only a small fraction is really being utilized. You have to understand that these numbers that I'm giving out, they are extremely crude, right? It matters if it's, it's a wheat field or a corn field, if it's in Brazil or if it's in the US, etc. But just to give us roughly something to analyze what is happening here. Okay, what is the next thing that would happen? So we already, let's say, we absorb the photon, everything is happening. What is the next thing that's supposed to happen? So now we have the process of photochemistry that is happening here. And basically, you have to go from the, let's call it energy currency. This is the thing that has been absorbed here, into biochemical, or if you want, the carbon storage, which is effectively, the thing that would serve also for the food there. So this is all of the things that you might have learned or not of all this thing called the Kelvin cycle, of taking CO2, taking the energy that came from the sun, making it into a sugar, lots of reactions there. This whole process of trying to go from the energy that has been absorbed to the carbon storage, that will give us about another factor of 2. Then you already have the thing that you want to eat, but what would happen to much of it? It would be respired, right? What is respired? That means the plant hasn't done it just for us. It's been doing it. It needs this energy in order to build the plant itself, to maintain itself, to run all of the different processes. So this is called this is respiration loss, which in a way is like what you have to pay in order to get what you want in the end. This again, there's all sorts of averages on that. That would give us another roughly factor of 2. And now I'm already at what I wanted. I started from photons in the sun. Now I already have a plant that is made this biomass that is not being respired. What would be the last stage of loss from this into my grains? I can't eat the whole thing, right? There's some of it underground, some of it in the stems. So this is known as the harvest index. This is what fraction out of the mass or out of the calories are ones that I can actually consume as a person. And this is roughly, again, a factor of 2. And this is a factor of 2 only after humanity spent, thousands of years, literally, of improving that. Because originally, if you look at what wild wheat looks like, or wild maize known as teosinte that the Mexican use, these are like these tiny ears of corn that if you look at the mass of it, or the energy content out of the whole energy content of corn, that would be very, very small. But then in many, many years of doing breeding, we increased that fraction, and the Green Revolution and using fertilizer and all sorts of things, we got to a stage where actually in the end, in a wheat or in corn, you'll have that half of the plant is actually stored in grains. So that's a huge success that we got to only a factor of 2. Originally, it would have been a factor of 10 or more. I think that was like a short tour inside the energies. What do we have here? 2, 4, 6, 8, 16, 16 times 5. That's 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. 32 times 5, that's 160. So roughly 0.5%. That's like grosso modo how we got to 0.5%. What does that mean? If I have 0.5%, so this means I'm now done also with this part. I got 0.5%. 0.5% out of 200 watts per meter, that gives me how much? I can use these two numbers to get this, right? So this is 1 watt per meter squared. Just 1 second. Okay, so I have 1 watts per meter square, and I need how much? How much? This was power needed per human. 100 watts. So how much area do I need? 100 meters squared. Okay, so I would need about 100 meters squared to give me enough grains such that when I eat them, I get about 100 watts. This is the average rate at which a field gives me calories that could be useful.
Per day.
Okay, so this is interesting. So again, this is per day. No, it's per year, per season. It's very confusing, right? this is like the average rate at which an area creates power in grains, and this is the average rate at which we're consuming, and therefore we need 100 meters squared, no matter if you continuously. Obviously, it happens like in quantas, right? It's not that I'm getting this amount of energy every second or every day. I'm getting it every growing season. But on the average, this is the amount of power that I'm getting.
But where do you refer to the growing time?
What?
Where do you take the growing time in this?
Where do we take the growing time? So the fact that we're getting, so this whole efficiency thing, about 0.5%, that's, if you like, this is like you're doing the efficiency over the whole growing season. And that's what, and this is where it's been taken into account. Yes?
Is the harvest index calculated on how much, on intake versus output? Or
The harvest index?
yeah, or is it
No.
calculated by how much is absorbed by human cells?
Okay, so the harvest index relates to out of the mass of the plant when you'll be cutting it down, what fraction of it you can actually eat that will come as grains. Yeah. So it does not take into account
Digestible
what.
fraction of the grain?
So it's very, very close to digestible. But then there's actually a few other factors that come into here that would make this number actually a very optimistic scenario for humanity. What are so there are two major issues why this would not be a good, like that you have to increase that.
The water source, you need water.
What are the main two things?
The energy needed to harvest.
Okay, there's the energy needed for harvest. Okay, we could use like very good tractors for that.
You need the water source to take it.
Okay, you need the water. You need water as well to
No,
put.
but on a source, if you're using already in your calculation all the, what do you call shidrugim that we made, so it will be so efficient, it's not enough only the water from the rain.
Right. So you also need to take from your aquifer. It depends where you are in the world, but this is actually a good average worldwide, and only a small fraction of it is necessarily needs to be irrigated. But there are two major things here. One is food loss. So through the pipeline of going from the grains in the field to what we'll be eating, there's another factor of roughly 2 that we're wasting. Some of it is in the processing, some of it is in the supermarket, some of it is in our fridge that we throw away that we don't eat. That's another factor of 2 roughly. The other major factor is if you look at the area used for agriculture, for cultivation on Earth, there's another factor of 2, which comes from what? What?
The distribution of land versus temper.
So it's from the distribution of the fact that about half of the food that we're growing, we're eating, and the other half is being fed to animals, cows, chicken, etc., that then do another conversion, and that conversion is not very efficient, so that in the end, they add to our total calories a relatively small fraction in terms of the energy of the 2,500 watts, or the 2,500 kilocalories that we need, but about half of the area needs to go to that. So there's another 2 factors of 2 here that would come, one because of food loss and one because of our usage of livestock in the process of converting from agricultural productivity. And by that I did not take into account the fact that there's also a lot of grazing. So that's much more area. This is like beef that goes around and eats in that does pasture land. And this is actually much more than a factor of 2. There's huge tracts of land, in Argentina, in the U.S., in Africa, and other places that are being used for that. But I'm not talking about that now. I'm talking only about cultivatable land that is being grown. If you need 100 meters squared, a factor of 2 would go because of food loss. Another factor of 2 would be used in order to grow food grains that would be fed to cows, poultry, chicken, and pigs. Okay, so I think with that we'll take a break and we'll reconvene in 10 minutes. Okay, so we'll continue. So the first point to say is that if some of the things that that I went through were a bit fast, no worries. All of the lectures, they're up on YouTube, so you can look at it again. And if you do or if you don't, you're also welcome to send it to your friends, you know, in the lab or around the world that might find it useful. You're welcome to serve as our representative in the marketing of those. I was asked about the question of how much water would be required. So I'll just mention it like really briefly. We said that we need about, say, 3,000 calories. And 1 gram is about 4 kilocalories. So that means that I need to eat 1 kilogram of grains per day. Right? If I want to go from that into water, there's a rule of thumb that might be interesting for you, and that is known as the water usage efficiency. And that is when the plant wants to, you know, has the power coming from the sun, it needs to take carbon dioxide. For that, it opens small holes, it's called stomata, on the leaf surface, and then it loses water molecule when the CO2 comes in. The ratio of that governs the water usage efficiency. It's usually in plants somewhere between 200 and 300, meaning that you'll have about 200, 300 times more water being lost per carbon that is being stored. Okay, quite amazing. Now, this would give us the carbon that has been stored. You remember that on that we had a factor of 2 due to respiration that would be lost. We had another factor of 2 coming from the yield index. So going to grains, I have a factor of about 1,000 here. So that means that I need about 1,000 liters to give me 1 kilogram. So 1,000 liters per day per person. That's roughly how much water do you need to invest.
But if you want to average over the general precipitation of the Earth, it is...
Okay, I'm just saying how much water is needed. Then whether it comes from me irrigating it or whether it falls as rain, that's a different question. Okay, so that was an aside just to close up on that. And anyone who wants to also make the connection between everything that we talked about the energy consumption that we have, and the last lecture we were talking about concentrations of proteins inside the cells and how to visualize it, as I shown in the slide, through like maps of them. We actually have, so some student was working on taking the energy consumption in the United States and putting it in the same kind of visual form of a proteomap as we did for the protein. So I'm passing it along. Anyone who wants to see how much goes into lighting or transportation or house heating, etc., I'm passing it along. So you're welcome to look at that while we continue. So the question that I'd like to start with now is how much power is consumed by a cell and I want to use that to tell me how many ATPs and this is a human cell that I'm thinking about. Okay, so we'll try to move a bit faster now. We already have most of our work done for us from this lecture and from previous lectures. So we know that the human would use about 100 joules per second. And now I want to divide it by the number of cells that I have. Anyone remembers it from one of the calculations that you did in the... So it depends on what would be your cell size in order to decide whether it would be 10 to the 13 or 10 to the 14. Let's say if we take a cell to be 1,000 micrometer cubed, which does not have to be exactly characteristic, but let's say I was going with that, for a 100 kilogram person, that would give me 10 to the 14 cells per human. And you can check me on that if you want. So 100, 10 to the 14, that means I have 10 to the minus 12 watts per cell. Watts is already per second, so it's joule per second, yeah. And how do I call that? That's 1 picowatt per cell. So that would be roughly the power consumption of this characteristic cell. Obviously, there could be changes if it's a brain cell, as was mentioned here, whether it's a muscle cell or something else. Yes,
So 100 joules per second was based on a lot of assumptions that might not be true for single cell. For example, we looked at how many calories we eat, but we know that we have 10 times more bacterial cells, and we don't know how much of that is consumed.
right.
How much
So
of those calories are consumed by bacterial cells. So I think that independent
Okay.
assessment of the cell.
So you raised the question of what happens here with, say, bacterial cells or with cells of different types. So what we had here is an overall for a human. Let's say now we're averaging over everything, 1,000 micrometer cubed cell. That would be an average of everything, every cell type that you want in the body. I can tell you that if you check on bacteria, they don't, even though we could talk about their number for a long time, in terms of the power consumption that they take up, it might not be completely negligible, but again, just like the brain will say 20%, but it wouldn't offset the average. Here again, it wouldn't be something very, but I actually want to move ahead with some other things. We could discuss it afterwards further. So I have about 1 picowatt per cell. Now I want to go from, so this answers this question. Now I want to know to the number of ATPs per cell. So for that, I have to know something about the energy associated with ATP. Anyone knows anything about that? So for that, I actually need to know what's known as the delta G of ATP hydrolysis. So this value is about 50 kilojoule per mole. What does that mean? That means that under the concentration that you usually get ATP inside the cell, if you hydrolyze it, which is what the cell uses as its energy currency, you get about 50 kilojoule per mole of such molecules of ATP. I would mention that this is a very tricky issue in the sense that the amount of energy in an ATP is actually ill-defined if you just ask it like that, because it really depends on what are the concentration of the products. It's all about the question of how much you're out of equilibria. Okay, if I just had ATP in equilibrium, which it's with its product, ADP and PI, phosphate, actually there would be no energy to be gained at all. The only reason why there is energy, that's because ATP is out of equilibrium in the cell. It's stable, but out of equilibrium. And then every time it's out of equilibrium, when you're hydrolyzing it, you're getting a lot of energy that could be used. I'm saying it very briefly. Anyone who wants to really dig deeply and understand some more about it, there's a wonderful book that I can recommend, and I'll be passing along here. It's by a professor by the name of Ken Deal. And the book is called Molecular Driving Forces. And I would say that's the best book I ever saw to try and understand what happens in terms of all these issues of thermodynamics, energies, that in biology are obviously critical, but very, very hard to explain and understand. So if anyone wants to know a bit more about it, that would be my recommendation. Okay, but under physiological condition, etc., this is roughly the value that we'll be getting. So I want to know how many ATPs. What do I have to do to this? This is in units of kilojoules per mole. This is units of picowatts. So this is my usual problem of units that don't talk with each other. I want to get from this mole, I want to get to number of molecules. So how do I go about that? We do that all the time, right? Avogadro number. So I want to multiply by something that would convert me to mole into molecules. So we know 1 mole is 6 times 10 to the 23 molecules. Don't pay too much attention to the minus here. That's because when you have something that's favorable thermodynamically, it's with the minus. But I won't be talking minuses and pluses here. I'm interested in how much energy do I get from the hydrolysis. So the 5 and the 6 is roughly the same. I have 10, but this is kilojoules, right? This is a kilo. So I have 10 to the 4 left here, 10 to the 23. That gives me 10 to the minus 19 joule per ATP. Okay, so far so good. So this is the amount of energy that I have per ATP hydrolysis. So how many ATPs do I need? So let's see. I need I need 10 to the minus 12 watts per cell. So the number of ATP, I would need 10 to the minus 12 watts per cell. Yeah, so let's write it. That's why I did want it as joule per second. Joule per cell per second. And I want to divide it by the amount of energy that I'm getting per ATP. That's 10 to the minus 19 joule per ATP. So from that you can 10 to the minus 12, 10 to the minus 19. That gives me 10 to the 7. ATP is divided by ATP, but this is already in the denominator. So that gives me ATP per cell per second. So I need about 10 to the 7 ATPs per cell of this size per second on the average over the whole of all the cell types in the body for that volume. Now notice there was one small step here that might be challenging. This was the amount of total energy that the cell uses, right? That's the total heat, if you like, heat content. Whereas here we're talking about ATPs. Now, not all of the energy in our food turns into ATP. That's exactly the question that was asked before, and we said that's about a third or something like that, right? So not everything turns into ATP, and when it's being turned into ATP, it's not in 100% efficiency, maybe a third or something like that. So from that, I don't want you to take 10 million ATPs necessarily. What I want to say, this is like roughly a million or a few million ATPs per cell per second. That's roughly the take-home message of how much ATPs do I get out of it, and this would be my answer to this. A few millions per second. So what do you think these few millions are being spent over? Why do the cell needs, what does it do with all of its energy currency? Movement I have. So motility. What is housekeeping? What does that mean? I want like mechanistic things that happen. Membrane potential. Protein synthesis. What integrity? Membrane integrity. So membrane, all sorts of things related to the membrane. Okay, so that's usually also happening on the membrane. Okay, so these are a few of the processes, and there's some others. So I want to zoom in on one of them and analyze it some more. And for that, I'd like to ask you the following. Let's take just one of those processes. Let's say I have a human cell that decides to spend all of its energy on which process would we choose? Let's take the protein synthesis. So protein turnover, if you wish. How quickly will proteins turn over? So let me explain what I mean. But first of all, let me give you some options. Let's say it would be a few minutes, a few hours, a few days, or a few weeks. Okay, so here's the question. I know every mammalian cell of this size in a human has about a few millions ATPs to spend per second. Let's assume out of all these mechanisms that could happen, it decides to spend everything on synthesizing proteins and degrading them. Okay, like this is what happens. And I'm giving you the protein degradation, as they say, on the house. Okay, let's say the whole degradation is negligible in terms of the amount of energy that you have to spend on it. So you just have to synthesize proteins in the ribosome. Okay? Given that you invested all of that, would you be able to turn over your proteome in a few minutes, in a few hours, in a few days, or in a few weeks? Who feels from their intuition and knowledge about cells that this would be in a few minutes? About 5 people. Few hours? Most people. More than half the class. Few days? No one? Few weeks? No one squared. Okay. Okay, so we're very strong into few hours. So I want to calculate that. Okay, let's do the calculation. So what would be my strategy in order to calculate that? How would you go about doing it? I would say we already have most of the components that we need. Well, one component that we need is the amount of, of how much money do we have to spend, right? So we already know we have a few million ATPs. Now we need to know something about how many amino acids do we need to synthesize to polymerize into proteins, and how much does each step take. Okay? So first of all, if I want to add another amino acid to a nascent chain of proteins, what would it cost me in terms of ATP? Anyone knows? If I'm a ribosome, I want to add another amino acid. So that usually takes about 4 ATPs, or ATP equivalents. That is, in order to add an amino acid. Why is that? Well, you have to look at the different stages. Basically, in order to load an amino acid into the tRNA, you take a GTP, I think, and you break it into a GMP plus PPI. So that's like effectively like 2 phosphate bonds. And then you go and you basically put it on the ribosome. That costs you another ATP. And then in making the ATP actually form the bond and move another step, that's another ATP. Okay, so that's about 4 ATPs. But as you see, the answer, even if you didn't know it exactly, even if you would have said 2 or 5 or whatever, it wouldn't change the order of magnitude. It wouldn't throw us from one to the other. Okay? So the other thing that we need to know is about how many such ATPs do we how many amino acids do we have in the proteome, right? So anyone remembers anything that's related to that? So I hear somebody saying there's about 300 amino acids per protein. But I need to know. So initiation is something that happens once. You need to invest a bit in that, not so much. But that only happens once per protein. So that's negligible. Okay, so what else do we need to know? Right, so we need to know the number of proteins. So you remember we said there's about 3 million proteins per micrometer cubed of cell. We talked about a bacterial cell, but it's very similar also in a mammalian cell, to less than, better than a factor of 2. So this would be per a micrometer cubed, and we're talking about a cell of 1,000 micrometer cubed. This is what we calculate for the number of how many millions of ATPs. By the way, it doesn't matter if I do a different cell, it would be the same answer as you'll see in a minute, Because if I have a cell that's 10 times larger, you'll have 10 times more ATPs, but then you'll also have 10 times more proteins. So it cancels, doesn't matter. Okay, so but I'm talking about a cell that has a 1,000 micrometer cubed. So I have another factor of 1,000. Okay, if you want, you can write it like that. Okay, so what does that bring me? I have 3 times 10 to the 6 times 3 times 10 to the 3, so that's 3 times 10 to the 9 proteins, times 300 amino acids, so that's 10 to the 12 amino acids per cell. Yeah, that was proteins per micro, that which is like a cell. Yeah, you're right. This is the way to do it. Thanks. Okay. And now I have 4 ATP equivalents in each one. So that means that in order to do a turnover, I would need 4 times 10 to the 12 amino acids. Let's see what's the most elegant way to do this. Just 1 second. Okay, so I have 10 to the 12 amino acids per. So that means that the energy, or ATP, per turnover would be what? Would be 4 times 10 to the 12 ATPs. Right? But now I wasn't interested in this question. I was asking in the turnover time, the maximal turnover time. Maximal turnover time. So what would that be? This would be the energy, or excuse me, that would be the ATP needed divided by the ATP rate available. Why is this equation correct? Because I can just multiply, right? I have some rate at which I have ATP available. That's about a few millions. Let's say 10 to the 7. I'm being maximalistic here. Times the turnover time that I'll have, this would be the ATP that I need. Is that equation clear, or I'm missing you here? Seems clear. Okay, so now we just need to plug numbers in. So what is the ATP needed? Exactly here, 4 times 10 to the 12 ATPs. What is the ATP rate available? A few millions. Would you mind if I choose 4? So let's do 4 million ATPs. What are the units here? Per second. Which brings me to what? Okay, so it's good that we chose 4, right? So this is 10 to the 6. And you see the units come 10 to the 6 seconds. What is 10 to the 6 seconds? It's about 10 days, right? 10 to the 5 seconds is a day. So it's just a second. So we're getting as a result a few days, maybe a few weeks, somewhere between C and D. So just to see that what we got here, it's actually maybe non-trivial. We're saying we know how, let's see, what are we depending on? We're saying we know how much energy, how much food we're eating, right? Let's see from what simple beginning we started. How much food are we eating? For the food that we're eating and knowing something about our mass, 100 kilograms, that's trivial. Knowing about how much ATP is free energy and how many ATPs do you need to synthesize something. From only those things that we started with, you can say something very surprising, seems to the whole class, also to me actually, that the maximal turnover rate, even if you invested all of your energy in ATP, in the protein turnover, you could not turn over any faster than something like 2 weeks. That, by the way, also gives us a good hint. Actually, in those things, protein synthesis is definitely a dominant factor. So even though it's not 100%, we're doing other things as well, it's definitely one of the dominant processes that happens inside the cell in terms of energy drainage. Okay, we have to finish soon, so another question about that?
Yeah, if this is about the rate, about the same rate in bacteria, how does it cell with like a 20-minute generation time? That was exactly my question. Proteins live so much longer than cells?
Okay, so I think this is a good puzzle to think about. How does that work for bacteria? I think the short answer is that bacteria would actually consume much more, if they grow rapidly, let's say 1 hour doubling time or 20-minute doubling time, you would find that two things happen. One is that they're consuming much more than 100 watts per 100 kilograms or 1 watts per kilogram. They have to consume much more. That's the main thing. And I don't even remember what was the second thing. This is the main thing. Okay? Oh, the second thing is that for them, it would be even more than for humans, the dominant drainage on energy consumption, the protein synthesis. Okay, I would challenge you to try and repeat that at some point in your head, the logic that we had here, and maybe even the calculation with the numbers. But for the exercise that you have this week, you have to do something else. It's already, will be when you open the website, you'll see it posted. You have a TED Talk that you need to watch. And in the TED Talk, there is a calculation that is being claimed regarding the ability to use biofuels, to grow biofuels to drive our cars. And the challenge for you is to try and check the calculation, the number that he states there, whether it's correct or not. Okay, so this is one element of your exercise for this week. The other is to choose a vignette that relates to the question of energies, the same time that we discussed here, to read one of them and to suggest some improvement or some other interesting idea that came to your mind. I will mention it in the final assignment. The kind of vignette that you need to write is really exactly in the spirit of those vignettes. So it doesn't have to be any longer than that. They are also like 2-page long or something like that. This is what you need to do. And there's a third thing.
The final project.
Yeah, and the third thing is you need to send us by next lecture your suggestion for what should be the final project that you want to present to the class. If you're still debating by more than one option, that's also fine. You can point that out. And a teaser for the next lecture. So, for the next lecture, next lecture, does anyone know what would be the subject? We'll be talking about rates. Okay, from energies, we're moving into rates. And in rates, the two very fundamental rates that I'm interested in inside the cell are transcription and translation. Okay, those central parts of the central dogma. So the question is, what is faster, in this case, let's say in bacteria, transcription or translation? And in this case, we'll have just 3 possible answers. The first would be translation. Next one would be transcription. And the third one would be roughly the same. Is the question clear? Okay, who's voting for translation being faster? About half the class. Who's voting for transcription being faster? About half class. Who's voting for the same? 5 people. Okay, we'll meet next week to find out. Thank you.